All right, this is the holiday edition of the Arise Exchange. Let's stick with the banking sector in Africa for the outgoing year. GT Bank, Access, and few other Nigerian banks were among the top 300 banking sector champions of the outgoing year 2024, and that was ranked by the Africa Report magazine based in Paris. The report considers the liquidity, solvency, the loan book, and other parameters in arriving at the leading banks on the African continent for the year under review. So I sat down with Kanika Segal. She's the business and economics editor of the Africa Report magazine based in Nairobi, Kenya, for more insights into the 300 Champions Report. Give me a sense of this survey. Why did the Africa Report decide to do this survey highlighting the 300 prominent financial institutions across Africa? Sometimes, for some folks, may just think, are you sure they have up to 300 over there on the continent? This is surprising.
So I think it's a survey that we've been running for about 20 years now as part of Jeune Afrique Media Group. And the origins of the survey mainly looked at asset size. So it's about, how large some of these financial institutions were on the continent. And over time, we've obviously included a lot more granularity in that survey as we're able to access a lot more data now as well. So we looked at around 40 different points, data points, and the 4 different categories, including, I think, solvency, liquidity, and there were 2 others as well. And we combine all of that information together to put together the ranking. And I think it's like no other ranking that you get because of the minutiae of detail that you're able to access looking at that. And I think one thing that is important to note, however, is that obviously, doing something Pan-African, you really need to understand that there's a lot of nuance and differences on the country, on the countries, on the ground, and then within these financial institutions. So while we're trying to put together a ranking of, the top 300 in Africa, having an understanding of those differences is really important as well.
Very interesting, Kanika. I subscribe to the Africa Report. When I saw that Nigerian banks, a couple of them were leading the top of the table, and I said, hold on a second. We just had a very brutal year, 2023, in terms of a change of politics, as it were, change of governance at the top. We've gone through, and we're still going through the fallout of exchange rate unification, the removal of fuel subsidy and all of those reforms, and keep throwing everything in the fire, as it were. But here are some of the biggest Nigerian banks coming out shining like a gold out of the furnace. How did this come about? Talk to me more about it.
Yeah. So I think what you need to understand is that Nigerian banks are used to, some of the inconsistencies, the political and economic risk that you get in Nigeria, combined with the fluctuations in the naira, the retrenchment of international companies from Nigeria. They understand that, I think, working in Nigeria is quite a risky place. And that is reflected in the way that they bank. So I think a lot of Nigerian banks, they focus on the top tier clients, the well capitalized, well run corporates. And I think that's reflected in their financials. So they had generally low NPL ratios, for instance. I think their loan to book ratio was pretty solid as well. But what that means is that they're not really financing the broader economy. So while you mention all of this turbulence within Nigeria, within the economic landscape, the political landscape, it's not necessarily reflected so much in what the banks are doing because they are quite risk averse and they're focusing on a portion of the clients that are relatively stable throughout time.
Very interesting. But again, let's move a little bit to the Eastern African corridor where you are and a little bit of Central Africa. When you look at the big names such as the KCB Group, Equity Group, the INM making massive inroads outside the traditional Eastern African corridor, going into the Central Africa, the DR Congo, for example, making a big splash over there. Then a couple of Nigerian banks coming in and making some inroads into the Kenyan banking sector, financial services industry as well. Talk to me about the Kenyan banking space, despite also some turbulence that Kenya had also seen over the past year in terms of the state of the economy, debt from multilateral, bilateral institutions, some exit from the stock market because of exchange rate and FX situation. How did the banks really fare over there, coming out shining as well in your report survey?
So I think the difference in particular between the Nigerian banks and the Kenyan banks, and this is a very general point, because obviously, like I was saying, you really need to dig down into the granular detail of the banks and the environments they're working in. But one of the main differences is the Kenyan banks are a lot more diversified. So they do focus a lot more on SME, retail banking, as well as corporate finance and the like. And I think because of that, so they've not maybe performed as well as the Nigerian banks in our ranking, but they're still doing relatively well. And so you can see some of that difference in things like the NPL ratio, which I think in Kenya is slightly higher, but that's because they're willing to take a little bit more risk. And that is reflected in the fact that they appear to finance and support the economy more broadly. And I think because of that risk profile, and I guess the opportunities that you see in East Africa, there is a lot more regional competition and regional penetration of, KCB, for instance, an equity bank, they're looking to expand across the region. And I think they're both as well. And same with maybe international companies are looking to see what's going to happen with Ethiopia coming up soon, if there's a bit more financial liberalization there. So I think that's what's behind the differences with the Kenyan banks.
Great. For South Africa, just to touch on North, East, West, and South briefly in this conversation, Kanika, in terms of South Africa, of course, these are where some of the biggest banks in Africa are located. First Rand, for example, in South Africa, but big footprints into Kenya and Eastern African corridor as well. You've had Net Bank and a few other Standard Bank and Standard Chartered and the rest of them. How do Southern African banks, big financial services, performed in this latest 300 ranking?
So I think, as you can see, compared to our ranking last year, they've moved quite far down. In the 28 banks that we look at, the consolidated banking groups that we look at, the South African banks have come down the ranking slightly. And I don't think this is because they're not performing well.
All right, you can get the rest of that online, that interview on the 300 banking champions across Africa in the year 2024.